It's the end of the year, which means book review! So today I will be reviewing the 20 books that I read in 2021, plus 2 bonus books. I started off the year with Fangs by Sarah Anderson. You might know her from Sarah Scribbles, which is her webcomic series, as well as she's put out a few books. This book, Fangs, is about a werewolf and a vampire who start a relationship, fall in love, and yeah, it's adorable, very cute. I love the artwork. It's all black and white. Also, just the book, the black edges to the pages. Yeah, just kind of very simple artwork. It definitely does tell a story through this graphic novel, but each page is kind of its own little mini story. I think she actually put these out as a web series first and then put it together into a actual book. Really enjoyed this. Really kind of nice, light read. Picked it up, read a few of the panels, read something else, came back to this, read a few more. And yeah, it's a very cool idea, but also just reflects a lot of the things that happen in a relationship, the little fights you get into, the compromises you end up making, the sweet things that you do for each other. Yeah, it's just an adorable book, really great premise. Next up, might have been an interesting choice to read during a pandemic, but that was Station 11 by Emily St. John Mandel. This book takes place mostly after a pandemic. A pandemic has wiped out a huge portion of the world, and it focuses around this performance troupe that is traveling around performing Shakespeare. There are a number of chapters that kind of jump. It does kind of jump back and forth between the a few different characters' perspectives of like the pre-pandemic, what was going on for them during the initial outbreak, and then I think it's like 10 years later, there's a significant time jump. Yeah, very good, really interesting. There's a series that's coming out that I'm interested to see how well it is adapted. I think it will be adapted well. Really cool, and like just kind of the exploration of how do people move on, kind of that post-apocalyptic, as well as how does art play and theater play a role in a post-pandemic, post-apocalyptic world. So if you're looking for apocalyptic fiction, that might be a little too close to home right now, but this was a very good book. I really enjoyed it. Next up, I jumped into a fantasy trilogy, and that is the Modern Fairy Tales by Holly Black. So is Tithe, Valiant, and Ironside. This is just a giant collection of all 3 of the books. I enjoyed these. I think I've preferred some of Holly Black's other books. I absolutely love Darkest Part of the Forest. These have a similar feel of that modern fairy tale as the trilogy is called. So the fae, and very much not like Cinderella fairy tale, but fae fairy tale that Seelie and Dark Seelie courts play a huge part in these books. I preferred Kay's kind of storyline over Valerie's. So Tithe and Ironside I really enjoyed. Valiant took me a little bit to get through. I actually kind of stopped reading about partway through, and then had to kind of jump back into it. Just something about that character was a little bit too much like angsty teen for me at the time. But yeah, I really enjoyed this. If you're looking for modern fairy tales, the kind of our world with some fae elements added into it, check this trilogy out. Another book by Holly, I read How Do You Like Me Now by Holly Bourne. This book was different than I was expecting. I think I was expecting much more comedy when I started reading this book. And it does have some very comedic moments, some very self-deprecating type humor from the main character. But it is a lot more of a difficult read than I was anticipating, just because it deals with she's in a relationship with a narcissist. It's not a good relationship. She's watching, the main character is kind of in this weird part of her life where she had this huge success professionally writing this book and is now going out and doing all these speeches, but hasn't written another book since. And she's now watching all of her friends kind of getting married and having kids. And her life is feeling very stagnant. So it's a lot of her kind of coming to grips with that and figuring out, what to do. Really good, very, very heart-touching, tender, honest writing, very easy read, I will say, as far as the readability. I tore through this pretty quickly, just because I kept wanting to know more. I love the main character. The main character felt so much like a real person and like somebody that I was like, I would want to be friends with this person. And, parts of myself I saw in the character. But yeah, it was a lot deeper. I think I was expecting the career side, and not necessarily the relationship side. That being said, very good book. Next up, I read Broken in the Best Possible Way by Jenny Lawson. I've enjoyed all of Jenny Lawson's books so far. I read the blog her blog on a fairly regular basis. I think this has a little bit less of those family anecdotes and stories in it, and much more of a dive into the mental health aspects of some of her other books, as far as where that divide goes. It's much more mental health heavy. So very good book. Really great message, as well as kind of nice aspect of not feeling alone if you are an individual who deals with depression, anxiety, any kind of mental health disorder. It is nice seeing other folks who are dealing with it, struggling with it, but also finding the positives, finding those moments of joy. I really enjoyed it. But yes, if you're looking for kind of more of the family anecdotes, there are a lot less of that family and personal anecdotes in this than in some of her other books, but would still recommend. 2021 has apparently been a pretty big year for me for sci-fi reading, and I think it is because of this next series that I read. The Becky Chambers series that starts with The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet. I love these books. These are exactly what I want good science fiction to be, where the science does feel like it's not pseudoscience, it's real possible science, that kind of speculative how things could be in the future, but also using science fiction as a way to examine the big questions about humanity, like what it is to be a person, how do we relate to each other, how do we form communities, how do we make big decisions when nobody else is going to remember us or maybe be around for those decisions. Each of these books definitely kind of dives into one of those things, and just such a fantastic universe. There are all sorts of these different alien races that all feel very unique, very different. They're not just humans with a slightly different thing. It is if they were on a different planet, they would evolve very differently from something that is more avian to reptilian to, there's one that's kind of a, pseudopod, so octopus squid type. The first book definitely deals with the Long Way to a Small Angry Planet, is following along with this crew on the ship that is making these gates that allow them to travel between long distances by folding space, but you have to kind of put that connection, you have to fold it first. So they're on this long trip, and it is how those different cultures interact, the different species that are on the crew all have very different cultures, very different traditions, but finding ways to get along with each other, to understand each other, to work with each other. The second book focuses on the AI of the ship from the first book. So I will say there's definitely a connection between the first and second book. The third and fourth exist in the same universe, but there's not as strong of a connection between the characters. There is a slight connection in the third book, and the fourth book kind of is it's almost a standalone. But the second book, which is A Closed and Common Orbit. This one was my favorite out of the four, and I think it was because it showed what it's like to have an anxiety attack in such a vivid way, but it was an AI having it, and put into words some things that I was like, oh my gosh, this is how I've felt. I've just never really known how to express it. Which I think is one of the great things that science fiction can do. It's so good. The third book, A Record of a Spaceborne Few. I think this was my least favorite, and part of that is there are a lot of characters in this. All the other two books, it does jump between the different characters' perspective. This had, I think, the most different perspectives, as well as they were almost all humans rather than various other alien species. There were a number of characters that were similar enough in their voice, not necessarily in a bad way, but it was just a little bit harder for me to differentiate who the characters were, and especially early on, you didn't spend a ton of time with any of the characters. There were shorter chapters, so I didn't feel as connected to any of them, but I did really enjoy it. And then the fourth book, To Be Taught If Fortunate, kind of takes place very far before the other three, looking at a group of astronauts off exploring for potential planets to terraform, and dealing with the, leaving, having to travel so far and knowing they're never going to return to their families. If they do ever return to Earth, it's going to be like decades, if not hundreds of years in the future. And then also because there is that distance and time delay, finding out what things are happening on Earth and how it affects them, and them having to kind of make decisions on their own, knowing that, well, we're not going to be able to send a question or send information and get a response in time to make a decision. We're kind of on our own out here. Really good. The first three are, significantly larger, really deep dives. This one is a nice kind of, I feel like you could pick it up and read it on your own, potentially even read it before the other ones, as a little bit of a, appetizer into the universe. But, Becky Chambers, possibly the best science fiction series that I have read in a very long time. If you enjoy science fiction, read this. Read her work. It is, yes. I think these were the best books that I read this year. So I decided to do a little bit of fantasy before jumping back into any science fiction. And I read The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue by V.E. Schwab. I've really enjoyed all of V.E. Schwab's other books. And this was a very fun, lighter fantasy than like The Darker Shades of Magic. It does feel very much like it is in our world, but there is a fantasy element to it. There's also kind of a historical fiction-esque aspect to this, because the main character, Addie LaRue, through things, ends up with this ability to basically live forever, but no one remembers her. Kind of like once the day goes by, or they've stopped looking at her, they just can't remember her. There's no long-term, short-term memory of her. So it was interesting kind of seeing how she survives going through, starting out in kind of late medieval French, I think, France, traveling around the world, as well as through these different time periods and adjusting to the culture of that time. And then there's a absolutely beautifully heartbreaking love story in this. The kind of fantasy magical element is a really interesting way of handling making deals and bargains. Yeah, I really enjoyed this. While it is a pretty hefty book, it was a pretty quick read just because I kept wanting to know what was next, what was going on, where was she going next, where was the story going next. Yes, very, very engaging book. Thanks to all of our patrons, especially Black Dragon Gaming. If you want to support our channel, you can head on over to patreon.com/rollforinitiative. Check out the perks of being a patron. Next book I kind of read while I was reading a few other books, and it was a nonfiction, and it's The Anthropocene Reviewed by John Green. So I already was familiar with this kind of premise of this book because I'd listened to the podcast from the same name. And this is a collection of essays that John Green has written, giving the various aspects of the Anthropocene, so the human-focused world, a rating on a 5-star scale, as well as he talks about aspects of his own personal life that have to do with those various topics. Very moving, very, like, I was in tears several times. There were a few things that made me laugh out loud. I know the audiobook of this is also absolutely excellent. Ryan listened to the audiobook. There are slight differences. I know there's 1 or 2 entries in the book that aren't in the audiobook, and there's something in the audiobook that's not in the book, that he did just kind of because he knew those were slightly different mediums. Yeah, really enjoyed this, as well as I feel like this is a good book of essays that I will come back to a few of these essays when I kind of want to revisit them for whatever reason, whether it's the emotional, whether it's I feel like I'm in a point where I can relate to that essay a little bit more or in a different way than I previously had. But yeah, this is definitely going to stay on our bookshelf for a long time. So to continue the science fiction kind of trend that the Becky Chambers books got me on, I picked up Hail Mary by Andy Weir. So I previously read The Martian as well as Artemis by Andy Weir, and I know a lot of people, myself included, were a little disappointed in Artemis. It just didn't feel as good, which The Martian was so good. This felt much more like The Martian. It felt a lot more, the science felt a lot more well thought out than I feel like Artemis kind of did, and it interwove with the story a lot more. There was a lot less exposition. And also just the premises of this book was really interesting. Without spoiling it, because this is basically the first chapter, the main character wakes up on a spaceship and has no idea how he got there. He has amnesia, finds out he is on a mission to save humanity, essentially, but doesn't know why he's there, doesn't know what it is he needs to save humanity from. So you are finding out what is going on kind of as the same time as the character, as his memories are coming back. So it does jump between present and past fairly seamlessly as the memories are kind of sparked back up. There are a few parts in this book that it does get a little hand-wavy with the science, but also it makes sense. Why it's a little hand-wavy. Yeah, a very, very good book. You know, again, a pretty meaty book, but very engaging. So it doesn't feel long, but is definitely something that, like, if you're looking for something that you're gonna take you a little bit longer to read just because there's a lot there, this is a book for you. Decided to jump back into fantasy with The Midnight Library by Matt Haig. I really enjoyed this book. It was a little different than what I was expecting. When I read the blurb for it, I was like, oh, this person dies, and they get to kind of re-experience their life, but see what it would have been like had they made different choices. And I will say kind of a bit of a content warning. The reason the main character is in this, they're not quite dead, they're in kind of this in-between, is because they have attempted suicide. So if that's something that, might be triggering or difficult for you to deal with content-wise, maybe this isn't the book for you. But that being said, very well written, really interesting premise, and especially that idea of like, I feel like everybody has those moments where you do think back like, what if I had said yes to this opportunity? What if I had dated this person instead of this person? What if I had gone on this trip? All of these different choices that you make that may or may not have had a huge impact on your life. And she kind of gets to explore that and see, did it make her life better? Did it make it worse? And for the most part, it just kind of, it was different. I feel like this is a book that it deals with kind of some darker emotions, but in a very empathetic, honest way. I enjoyed this book. It was not quite what I was expecting, but very enjoyable. Next up is, I think, my least favorite book that I read this year, and that is Eat a Peach by David Chang. We lost the cover for this along the way. This is a good book, I think, especially if you like David Chang, Momofuku, that his kind of whole story. If you enjoy Anthony Bourdain type writing, you will enjoy this. Ryan had picked this up to read, and I decided, sure, I'll read it as well. There was about 3/4 of the way through the book, it felt like I was reading it at that point because I had read most of the book and just wanted to finish it. It also felt like David Chang had agreed to write a book and was writing it to finish it. It wasn't quite my cup of tea, but I think if you are interested in some of the behind the scenes of a restaurant, you really like David Chang's story and want to find out more about it, this is a good book for you. Next up, I read Goldilocks by Laura Lamb. This is described on the front cover as a book baby between The Handmaid's Tale and The Martian. And yes, that is very, very accurate. This is great science fiction book if you want kind of that sci-fi feminist thriller. And I really enjoyed this. The kind of twists and turns that it took with the characters, with what was going on, was very enjoyable. Kind of didn't see it coming, but as soon as it happened, it was like, oh my God, this makes sense, which is how I want those twists and turns to kind of play out. I will say there were moments just with some of the politics and things that are going on in the world of this book that I was like, this is too close to what's happening in our world for comfort. But yeah, I really enjoyed this. Continuing on with 2021 being the year that I read fantastic sci-fi, this continued to be, on that list. Next up, I read a translated book, and that is The Beast Player by Nahako Uehashi. I probably did not say that name correctly. I'm so sorry. And it was translated by Kathy Hirano. So the author of this book is Japanese, and this is a fantastic fantasy book, especially if you're looking for something that is not your traditional, Western fantasy. Yeah, it's a very, very well fleshed out, vivid world, and I'm really interested to see where the series continues in The Beast Warrior, which is the next book. I really enjoyed this book. I don't know how to describe it because it is different enough than a lot of the other high fantasy that I've read, but was very engaging. And yes, if you're looking for something kind of different than the normal traditional traditional Western fantasy, I think this is a good book to pick up. Decided to read a whodunit? I don't know. So I picked up The Guest List by Lucy Foley. I really enjoyed this. This is definitely a book where most of the characters are the kind of people that you kind of love to hate. The premise is that someone has wound up dead at a wedding, and so it is told kind of the couple of days before the wedding, following various characters' perspectives. All of the characters that you follow are kind of the potential suspects for who committed the murder, as well as it's being told kind of in the day of the wedding from a bunch of the groomsmen's perspective, because they're kind of the ones that discovered the body and all of that. So yeah, this was a very fun read. Lighthearted, like, this is a good beach read. Not anything deep or meaningful here, but just a good popcorn book. And then because I had enjoyed the kind of whodunit nature, a little bit lighthearted aspect, like not as mentally deep as some of the other books that I read, I decided to go with another one, and this one is The Lighthouse Witches. This does have a bit of a fantasy element to it. I really enjoyed this. It takes place in Scotland, and kind of the main character, her family kind of disappeared as a kid, and then her sister shows up like 15, 20 years later, but is the same age as when she disappeared. And so it's delving into what happened when she was a kid. It's told partially from her mom's perspective, as well as some of her sister's perspectives, and what happened in the town beforehand. There's kind of a journal that one of the characters picks up that you end up reading excerpts from. Really interesting, cool, kind of thriller mystery novel that has that kind of fantasy element to it. Oh, and it's by C.J. Cook. I forgot to mention that. So yeah, I really enjoyed this. If you're looking for that kind of mystery book that does have that fantastical element to it. All right, and the two kind of bonus books that I'm going to mention are Bumping and Expecting Better. So if you've missed the previous two videos where I've talked about it, I'm pregnant, we're expecting. So I have been kind of reading these on and off as my pregnancy progresses, as I move through the different trimesters. Bumping is a pretty good, like, I feel like similar to what I've heard about, like, what to expect when you're expecting. It's a little bit of a bit more personal look at pregnancy, but doesn't really get too technical or too scientific. So the author wrote it as she was kind of going through her first pregnancy. So there are those nice anecdotes from somebody else who's kind of been there, been through it. And yeah, just kind of, this is a nice, like, little bit of an introduction. This is the book that I think I would suggest to anybody who is expecting, because the author, I think she is a, like, financial writer. She deals a lot with statistics. And so a lot of what she tackles in this book, it's a lot of the same information that's in Bumping, but from a much more, like, statistics, scientific, like, let's look at the research and what does the research actually say? How old is the research? Are there any problems with the various studies? And there was a lot of information in here that I had not found elsewhere, like breaking down what the differences are between the various, like, levels as far as, like, what's okay to take for medications and stuff like that when you're pregnant, and why they are in those different levels. Looking at, like, okay, well, why do they say don't scoop your cat litter? Okay, well, actually, what you need to be more concerned with is gardening, because you're much more likely to run into that out and about. Gardening than necessarily with an indoor cat who's always been an indoor cat. Yeah, and it just kind of gives you a lot more of that data and information so that you can make an informed decision instead of just kind of blanket being like, this is what you need to do. And so for me, I found that really helpful because I'm still kind of following a lot of the general pregnancy advice, but I at least now understand why, why I shouldn't have sushi, why I shouldn't, use certain face products, and kind of what the risks are, so that I can make a little bit more of that informed decision. Very well written. So if you are the kind of person that you want more of that data to make the decision for yourself, or at least understand what is going on, I think this is a highly recommended book for any pregnant individuals, or if you're a spouse or partner of somebody who's pregnant and you want to understand what they're going through, you can also get stuff out of this. Both of these books do have kind of sections that are the majority of it is geared towards the mom, but they do have sections that are kind of geared towards the partner as well. I think bumping has more of that than necessarily expecting better. All right, so those are the 20 books plus 2 that I read in 2021. Have you read any of these books? I would love to hear what you thought about them down in the comments below, as well as what was your favorite book that you read this year? Is there anything that I should add to my TBR list for next year? Probably not going to get nearly as much reading done with a newborn, but I might try dipping my feet into audiobooks, just so I can kind of continue reading even if I can't physically be holding a book. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, I hope you give it a like and share it with any fellow book nerds, and we'll see you next time on Roll for Initiative. Bye! Okay, gotta sit down. Oh. Yes, I did it without them falling.